It always catches me. I try to get one last sip of coffee in before before we go live. But chat, when you get in here, let me know. Give me a holler if everything is good on video and audio. I say this all the time, even though it always is. But welcome to the Adam Makes Beer April 2024 Industry Pro interview with Jessie Smith of Queen City Quality Labs. Adam Makes Beer is now a podcast. Check out Spotify, Apple Podcast, and see all the long-form brewer interviews we've done. After you subscribe, please leave a review and comment as well, because it really helps support the work I'm doing. Also, if you are new to the channel or podcast, go to Adam Makes Beer on YouTube, click the playlist tab, and see tons of information. Brew days, techniques, tutorials, over 716 videos now. As always, if you are getting value out of this content, please follow, rate, like, comment, and share with your brewing friends and craft beer enthusiast homies. And if you have the means and feel as if my content has benefited you, consider a channel membership for $2.99 a month, which gives you priority for Q&A live streams and quarterly merch drawings. Or feel free to drop super chat tips in the comments or chat. Also, make sure to check out the Adam Makes Beer merch store. This is one of the first times I'm not wearing an Adam Makes Beer t-shirt in a little bit. I'm rocking the Sonder shirt for what it's worth, even though it's like, I think it's the exact same color as the last Adam Makes Beer shirt I wore. But anyways, speaking of amazing customer service, that's what we call a segue. Blickman Engineering has been the pioneer of nano brewing, and they have helped hundreds of successful breweries achieve their dreams since they started with one barrel systems in 2006. Now offering a full suite of brew houses up to 15 barrels skidded and insulated, matching cellaring equipment, keg washers, grain mills, and more size specifically for the nano brewer. Blickman Pro Brewing systems are competitively priced without sacrificing quality. And the simple design and factory direct support makes support from our brewing experts get you up and running faster than anything else on the market. When you're ready to go pro or just kicking the tires, be sure to reach out to them for expert advice and a partner to help you through it all. Turn your dreams into reality by reaching out to Phil, Tom, or Josh at proseries@blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's proseries@blickmanengineering.com. Blickman Engineering Pro Brewing is proud to be the equipment sponsor for this channel and is committed to helping every brewer, no matter where they are in their journey. And as I mentioned, today we are talking with Jessie Smith. Jessie, how you doing?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm really excited to chat. We have, well, I mean, previously when we chatted like 2 seconds before we started the live stream, this is the second time we're talking. And I saw your Instagram, and what stuck out to me is that, and to me, it was fun and it was informational. You do like raw material informationals. You have some cool reels that you do, some that are fun, some that are a little bit more sciencey, a technical term. And yeah, and your workspace, which I was complimenting on you before, is bright and cool looking, and you look like somebody that was enjoying what you're doing. So we jumped on a call, and yeah, and we thought a podcast might be a good idea.
Yeah.
So yeah. Well, if you could kind of explain to us a little bit about your path into the industry.
Yeah, my path into the industry was essentially running away from a PhD program. I went through school, I studied biochemistry, and realized I didn't want to do a PhD. I didn't want to do academic research as I had originally thought. So I was like, okay, what other industries need my yeast research background? So to apply to breweries all over the country, and worked at St. Arnold's in Houston for 6 years. So that's where I got my start. And it was kind of like, okay, maybe I'll just work for a little bit and then go back to school. But I fell in love with the industry. So I've been doing it ever since.
Sure. So you were, so I originally, I have a history degree,
Hmm.
and my goal was to be a history professor someday, and have like a jacket that had like leather patches on the
Hmm.
elbows. You might see me about campus occasionally smoking a pipe. Okay. And
Yeah.
thumbing through like a great work of some sort. That
Hmm.
was definitely what I had in mind for myself as like a 22-year-old young man. What was kind of the mindset, like, because obviously you didn't go the PhD direction, but what was kind of the goal when you were considering that?
Kind of the same thing, but on a science side to it. So white lab coat,
Yeah.
teaching lectures and things like that. But once I started working in a lab as part of my research requirement for my undergrad, I could see that my overseeing professor, she wasn't doing as much hands-on lab work. And that's what I loved the most
Yeah.
about it. So it kind of showed me, okay, you're doing the teaching side, but then also you're writing grants, you're writing papers. It's a lot less hands on lab work.
Yeah.
So that's what I gravitated towards. And I wanted to kind of keep being able to do that, being in the lab, being on my feet,
Sure.
and working on the experiments.
Sure. And so your undergrad was in what? Biology?
Biochemistry.
Biochemistry.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And then was it just what was the interest in the alcohol side? Did you consider like wine side or anything like that, or distillation?
I had applied to wineries and distilleries. I think the biggest draw with the alcohol was the whole yeast research. So I was doing a lot
Yeah.
of yeast propagation
Yeah.
for all of my experiments. So I really got to understand how yeast grows, all the single colonies and things like that, and really got in tune with yeast growth. So then it was like, okay, what other industries have this? So did look at wineries. I really did like the kind of farming aspect of
Sure.
wineries.
Hmm.
But a lot of breweries have their own dedicated lab space. So that seemed like a good fit. As far as distilleries, they don't need as much quality control because they've got
Yeah.
so much alcohol. They have a lot of yeast strain things, which is super
Yeah.
cool. But, the different aspects of quality control really aren't as nuanced as with brewing. So that one kind of felt like the right fit for me.
I like that language because it is such a mind blower when you think about when you're packaging spirits as
Hmm.
opposed to packaging beer. Um, there was one place that I was saying, yeah, it just blew my mind. Like
Hmm.
the whole notion of it, the whole
Yeah.
notion. It's so apples and oranges.
Yeah, where I'm like, very detailed with sterile technique and, all these things. They're like, no, it's fine. We're okay. I'm like,
Sure.
all right. I guess you got all the alcohol behind you. That's cool.
So you got your degree, and then it was straight to St. Arnold's from there.
Yes. Yeah. Moved from Buffalo to Houston right out of college. And whew, that was a culture shock, temperature shock, all of it. But it was really fun. It was cool to be in such a big city. And St. Arnold was a very large brewery at that time,
Yeah.
compared to other ones around them. So it was a great place to get my start.
Sure, sure. And even just like you said, even the climate change, but before we went live, where I was talking about how, I think Buffalo it's, I don't think anybody thinks it's Midwest, but weather-wise,
Hmm.
it's certainly Midwest. And then going to the Houston area, that's wild. As
Yeah.
far
Wild is the word for it. I remember the first day I went to the brewery, was getting a tour before I even started working there. And we were inside walking around, and then it like downpoured for like 5 seconds. And then the humidity was in. I was like, oh my God, I can't breathe. This humidity. I could cut it with a knife. So that was like the first day.
Sure, sure. Well, and so how long were you in Texas or at St. Arnold's?
6 years.
6 years.
Yeah.
6 years.
So they had an established lab program. So I got to learn
Sure.
a lot there. And yeah, it was a great place.
That's interesting to me because my first reaction is 6 years. That's a solid amount of time. And now I'm thinking about it through a brewer's lens where I know that, we tend to be a bit of a transient
Hmm.
population. Did you find a lot of turnover? Transient makes it sound like hobos, maybe like a railroad thing. But that's not what well, kind of, but maybe.
Kinda.
But but did you find that there was a lot of turnover on the lab side as well in the industry?
Not as much, because again, Houston, St. Arnold had an established lab program.
Yeah.
We were one of maybe 5 or 6 when I first started that actually had a lab program, and theirs was well and above a lot of the other breweries.
Sure.
So I feel like with lab, you kind of find a place and you'll stick with it.
Hmm.
Where brewers like Houston, there were 40 something breweries. If they're not, satisfied where they're at, or they feel like they've reached their peak where they're at, they can hop around to other ones. But again, with St. Arnold, there were so many different facets for me to learn. So it
Yeah.
was a good place to stay at, to really focus on microbiology, start running their sensory panel by myself, all those
Yeah.
things. So yeah, I feel like there's a little less turnover with lab programs for that reason.
Well, and that's first of all, it's a smart move, but also it's a testament to, and not everybody's at that stage, but I do think it's really important to, from a management ownership standpoint, it's important to have that viewpoint of we have to provide opportunity for
Hmm.
growth for our people. Now, at the
Yes.
larger company, that kind of comes a little bit more easily, right?
Hmm.
Because there's
Yes.
more bases that need to be covered and things like that. So
Hmm.
but that's interesting. Yeah, because 6 years is not necessarily a short time. So what is that path like in a brewery like St. Arnold? So you kind of hire in at what level, and then what are some of the steps that you kind of accumulate skill set wise?
Yeah, so the nice thing, kind of what you were saying, like about St. Arnold and employee retention, was that they did value continuing education.
Hmm.
So, kind of going in, learn as a lab tech, learning all the basics, learning all the microorganisms that can show up, things like that, the sensory side of things.
Hmm.
I wasn't super into drinking beer before that, but then once I
Sure.
got there, it was like, okay, all these sensory aspects are so cool. So really deep diving into that, and then just kind of like following the thread. And they were really great about that. Like, okay, you have obviously interest in yeast health propagation. Let's go with that. So getting all these little projects.
Yeah.
So starting off as a lab tech, and then by the time I left there, I was really focused on yeast health and propagation, and kind of managing fermentations, trying to optimize fermentations and scheduling and things like that.
Sure. Yeah, that's super interesting. Um, what did I want to ask you off of that? I think it's can you talk to me about like one experience that was a really big positive for you while you were there, like kind of through like a career lens, right? Like whether or not it was something like it was a light bulb going off, or it was a boost that you
Mm.
needed.
I would say either doing my Cicerone, because
Mm,
again, they were super supportive with that. So studying for it, passing that, and just too, it was kind of fun how supportive they were after passing it. Everyone
mm,
congratulated, and it was like, okay, this is a really cool
sure,
accomplishment. And
sure.
then kind of on that thread, but more of a career technical side, was yeast propagation. So
Yeah.
I worked with another brewer, and we built a propagation system with existing equipment at the brewery. So kind of
Yeah.
a proof of concept, like, all right, before we buy this crazy expensive propagator, let's see if we can do it. So all of
Yeah.
those steps, like I learned so much through that, learned so much by working with that particular brewer, and, helping to cut costs and things. That really started, kind of sparked another level of interest for me, where then I was tracking fermentations,
Yeah.
really diving into yeast health. And I've carried that on through, my subsequent places of employment. And actually, last month, I gave a talk about, wrangling London ale yeast.
Yeah.
So yeah, still to this day, it's like, okay, that's kind of my thread. That's been my thing that I'm very interested in, and helping brewers to kind of understand that.
Yeah, that's exciting and interesting, and it's a testament to, so sometimes people that are on like the smaller pub side or like a smaller distro side place, they see a larger production house and they say, who wants to make the same beer over and over and over
Hmm.
again? the flip side, and not that I'm saying that that's what was going on with St. Arnold's, but I know they're making a lot of beer.
Yeah.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So, but there's also something to be said about having a massive volume of reps on your brew house,
Yes.
in your cellar, right? And because you can't, if say I have a a seasonal Belgian beer that I'm working on, and I can only really brew it once a year. Well, I mean, you're waiting. You might as well be making wine at that point, like
Exactly.
with the amount of times that you can rep that out, right?
Yeah.
So that large production environment is really perfect for digging into those things.
Exactly. Where then from a data standpoint, you can compare, the same type of batch. You can really kind of make an experiment out of it where, all right, we're going to change one variable on this batch. Everything else is the same. So you get a little more research capability and data. Where if you're doing all those one-offs, that's tricky, where you could have something really cool that comes out and then you brew it again the next year. It's like, oh, it was kind of different, not quite the same. And it's hard to tell what the factor was sometimes.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'm super excited. So sometimes my mind starts going in a bunch of different directions at once, and I have to try to reset. So what in particular? So, and this is not like asking for like a humble brag or anything like that, but at the end of the day, and this is something that I talk about. That I try to talk about when I'm talking about career stuff, leadership stuff. There's something that each one of us do in an excellent way, right? Everybody has an area of excellence. So don't feel weird when I ask you to say something awesome about yourself here. But what's a skill set or talent that you possess that served you well in our industry?
I think it's the attention to detail, which comes from the lab side. Especially if you're doing these experiments over and over, kind of the same thing, and you're just compiling data. And then, all right, something's a little bit different with this one. So then I took that to the brewing industry. Okay, sensory, really diving into sensory things. This beer is slightly different. What am I picking up from it? Then looking back at the brew sheets, what did we do differently? And it could be just these minor changes where, hey, okay, that was a better fermentation. Our yeast health was better because we did one little thing differently. So being able to dive into those things, I think really has helped. Where sometimes with the brewing industry, it can be this, big, vast recipe. It's like, all right, let's dive down into the details and see how we can optimize it as well.
Would you also say that communication skills fall into that range for you as well?
Yes, I would say, I was right out of college, starting at St. Arnold, my first real job. And my communication skills weren't, top of the list when I first started there. So that was something that I learned. And that's actually the really nice thing about the lab side of the brewing community. There's no gatekeeping. We love to communicate. We love to help each other out. So partly, being able to rely on other lab people and use them as a resource. So communicating that hey, I found this really cool thing that worked for me. Let me know how it works for you. And, being able to bounce ideas off of each other. I think that's been super important for building my career.
Sure. Well, we talked a little bit about the beginning of your career at St. Arnold's, and then let's take it the step further. So, what are some of your personal goals in the industry? And you now have Queen City Quality Labs. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think since starting this, my goal has been to, I guess when I was thinking about leaving St. Arnold, I either wanted to go somewhere very big like Sierra Nevada, where they have all this crazy cool equipment and really, learn all that stuff, or I wanted to go somewhere smaller and help them grow their lab. So I think now that's kind of where I'm heading with Queen City Quality, that I want to be able to help as many breweries as I can. So they don't have to buy the equipment. I've got the background, the expertise, so I can really come in and help them with some of the stuff that's a little mind-blowing sometimes. Like, okay, how did this fermentation go wrong? Or where did this off flavor come from? I can come in and help them with that. And then kind of on that same thread, being back in my hometown, Buffalo, there are so many great breweries here. I would like to help them get to the next level and to
Sure.
be a city where people want to come to Buffalo and try all the beers, because there's a
Yeah.
lot of great places here now.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's start digging into a little bit some of the things on the beer side. So I have a very I have limited limited exposure
Hmm.
to things on the lab side, and it was kind of funny because I was thinking to myself as we were chatting about it, like for some reason in my mind I felt like I was separating like the yeast handling
Mm.
side of it, and then I don't even know if the other part is, but I think in my mind, like probably like spoilage organisms.
Hmm.
And then I was wondering, well, how do other things fit in? So like whether or not we're talking about um, uh, process derived diacetyl
Hmm.
acetaldehyde, different things like that. So to me it seems like there's a couple of different buckets, and it was as I was getting ready to have this chat with you, I was realizing that I was just kind of thinking of like essentially plating things. Like
Hmm.
I don't know why that's what, but I guess it didn't dawn on me that it's going to kind of be those range of things. So can you
Hmm.
talk to a little bit of like the scope of what you do?
Yeah, so I always say, the microbiological side, making sure nothing's growing in the beer that shouldn't be. And then the other aspect of quality control is making sure your beer is consistent every time. So if you're a newer brewery or just starting out, you can have variations in your batches. And sometimes the customer will like that. They're like, oh, okay, I had it this time. I liked this one a little bit better, and getting that feedback. But if you're a larger brewer, if you're Sierra Nevada, you
Yeah,
want that pale ale to be the same every single time.
yeah,
So it's kind of a combination of, the micro, making sure nothing's growing that can cause off flavors, and then keeping your alcohol content, your bitterness, your color, making sure diacetyl isn't present, making sure those things are consistent with every single batch.
sure, sure. So what is a typical day like for you? So if you have, let's just look at it not from the business owner standpoint, but just from the lab standpoint. What's a day in the life, a typical shift in the lab?
I would say that day to day can be totally different. It's kind of like on a weekly structure,
Hmm.
where if I'm getting samples from a brewery, I'll need to make plates. Doing
Hmm.
I'm pretty micro heavy with a lot of the tests I do for breweries.
Okay.
So making sure I have plates made ahead of time, and then some of the plates only have 5 days until they expire. So
Okay.
kind of coordinating that. So usually by like Wednesday, I'm making a set of plates, making a set of tubes, doing some plating on Thursday and Friday, and then kind of a spattering of, okay, this person wants alcohol, this person wants a VDK run. So that's
Yep.
kind of the nice thing about the lab side, that it's not the same every day. It's
Yeah.
always going to be mixed up. And then kind of from the business owner side, I go and pick up samples from
Sure.
breweries. So that's kind of a nice aspect too, to get me out there, to get me talking to the brewers, see what they've
Mhm.
got going on. So it's kind of, yeah, I never know what I'm really going to get most days. It's a good mix.
Do you feel like it's ever part lab work and part sales?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's definitely that was something that I had to learn and grow into, was
Hmm.
the sales aspect. But I love it now. It's really so fun. And now that I'm getting more, back into Buffalo, getting to know these brewers, going to guild meetings, Pink Boots meetings, it's like, oh, you're my buddies, and I want to help you out, and I want to help your beer. So if you have an issue, let's chat about it. Things like that.
Well, and I do think so. They used to say, I don't know if people still say this because it might not be true anymore, but people used to say that the industry is 99% asshole free. Have you ever
Yeah,
heard anybody say that before?
for sure.
I don't know if that still stands, or if it was true back when I was here, I said for the first time. But um, I do think something that I do think it's definitely an industry where people value personal connection,
Hmm.
and I think people value when you are genuine with
Yes.
them, right?
Yeah. And I
right.
think that's what's kind of helped me with Instagram
Hmm.
and kind of like what you were saying in the beginning, making it educational but also fun because
Yes.
it's beer. It's
Yeah.
fun. It's a great group of people. We're doing something that we all enjoy drinking.
Yeah.
So, having that balance there and especially coming from the academic side, be a
Yeah.
little more stuffy. And I've worked in, academic labs that were really fun and good groups, but the stress level, was very
Sure.
different. So that's what I really love about the brewing industry. It's pretty laid back. And yeah, everyone's so interesting and different, all their
Sure.
different backgrounds. I like diving into that with people.
Well, and you have people coming from different angles too, because you have people that are very much of like the artistic or the
Hmm.
culinary bent, and you
Yes.
have some people who are, really hardcore, like from the engineering standpoint.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and then the science side of it, and yeah, there's definitely all sorts.
Oh yeah. And I really, the engineering side, I think I've learned a lot from those particular brewers. The
Hmm.
ones that have that really technical engineering background and then want to optimize the brewing system and things like that. Those are the ones that I kind of, from a science side,
Hmm.
gravitate towards. But also, some of my favorite brewers I've worked with, they have been more of the artistic, recipe development.
Yeah.
And it's like, how did you come up with this beer? It's like, well, I don't know. I just did a little this, little that, and it was good.
Sure.
I was like,
Sure.
that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Absolutely. So you had mentioned that you are active in Pink Boots and that you are you're giving some talks and things like that. Can you tell us a little bit about your background with that organization and some of the things that you're doing?
Yeah. So Pink Boots, we started the Houston chapter. I think it was 2017 or 2018. And yeah, we had a really great group of women there, kind of all spread out along the
Hmm.
city. So that was great. We were able to grow that. And then I was the chapter leader in Houston. It was during COVID. So that was a little not so
Sure.
fun, virtual
Sure.
meetings, but it
Yeah.
really was a great experience. And I think during that time too, I won a scholarship through Pink Boots. So
Nice.
I was able to go to Fargo, did a malt course. So I think having that experience, and then I had to go talk about that to our chapter.
Yeah.
That experience really kind of helps me appreciate malt more and the
Yeah.
science behind that. So that was a cool experience. And now, yeah, being back in Buffalo, our chapter's kind of like getting revamped.
Yep.
So we're getting a good group of it's getting some growth. And then we just had a collaboration brew day, which was a huge success. And the beer
Sure.
was pretty good too. So
Nice. Nice.
it's a great organization. I really love it.
Does New York State? I'm not certain about different states and guilds and whatnot. Is there a Brewers Guild in New York State?
We have one in Western New York. I'm
Okay.
not, and then there's a Brewers Association for New York State.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so I'm not sure about other regions if they have their own guilds or
Sure.
associations.
Sure. So, like, are there yearly conferences and whatnot there locally?
Yeah, so the New York State one was just in March, and it's a fantastic conference. I
Yeah.
think it rivals CBC
Yeah.
because just the different talks that they have, marketing, accounting, technical brewing.
Hmm.
They have great keynote speakers. It's just a really well done conference.
Hmm.
So I've been doing that one for about 3 years since I've been back in New York State. And every year I'm just blown away by it. It's really, really well done.
How do you prepare for talks when you have to give like professional talks?
I just sweat a little bit.
So okay, so here's a question. So like I said, we for everybody at home, we have chatted once before this. So do you consider yourself an introvert or an extrovert?
Big time introvert.
Big time introvert. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is I always think I'm always fascinated by introverts that do a good job speaking publicly. And
Hmm.
that's like it makes sense for me because like so when we're done with this conversation, I'm going to have a hard time sleeping and I'm going to feel like I could shoot fire out of my hands for like
Yeah.
2 hours. I'm not even joking. So like I took a pretty extensive personality test a few years back, and like I'm in the 99th percentile for extroversion.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, like it makes sense. Or it's like, oh yeah, I'll go give a talk. I'll go talk for 2 hours on the internet to somebody.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Things like that. But I'm always fascinated when it's somebody that's introverted. So what's that like?
It's been practice, honestly,
Yeah.
to, really put myself out there. And I think too, the more talks that I've given,
Mm-hmm.
you kind of build up your confidence
Mm-hmm.
with that. So yeah, at the New York State conference a couple months ago, I gave one of my first like very technical talks about
Mm-hmm.
yeast health and propagation. So that one I think I was a little more nervous for because it was in a room of these talented brewers. I was like, oh my God, they're going to throw tomatoes at me if I say something wrong. And like, they're going to have all these questions. What if I can't answer them? But then once I got up there and started talking about it, the passion kind of comes through.
Yeah.
And that makes it so much easier.
Yeah.
But it's almost something where I have to push myself. Because like after, you said you'll be shooting fire. I'll be in bed after this. Well,
well, yeah, and I'm gonna be in bed wishing I could sleep.
yeah.
So yeah, that's that. So I've just started to do some talks. I've done a couple for the Ohio Craft Brews Conference the last couple of years. I think I'm gonna be doing a talk for a local or a district meeting for MBAA potentially. And then right now I'm trying to work on some stuff for the 2025 season or year, because you have to apply ahead of time. And so I'm working on some technical topic stuff, and I'm working on some like leadership career development things as well, because I don't think that there's necessarily a ton of that within the brewer space. But like so what I've been doing is I did another podcast. I did the Modern Brewer podcast, and we talked about that. And then I just did another one of my own where it was like unscheduled, and I just talked about different things about leadership. So I try to use it as like a brainstorm to try to put ideas together, right? But what you're doing is different because you're actually detailing technical information, right?
And
so that's a little bit different. Yeah.
And then especially with this past one, there was research and data involved with it. And that had been stuff I hadn't looked at for a while. So I really did have to do a refresher, where I've got another talk coming up. It's through the American Chemical Society.
Yeah.
And they're like, hey, we want to know about the chemistry of beer. I was like, that's going to be so fun. It's so laid back and chill. So it depends on the talk. And but yeah, like you said, planning ahead, especially if it is more technical or research based, you really have to have that base before you are ready to give the talk.
Yeah.
So planning ahead.
Yeah. No, that's cool. And I like one of the things that I do like about one of the things I like about the Master Brewers Association, I do love going back and peeling through Technical Quarterly and digging into some of that research side stuff. Because I do think that brewing is an industry which can be driven by like, I don't know, I don't want to say BS, but sometimes there's a lot of myths floating around.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
About things. And I was surprised when I went from the home brewing side to the pro brewing side, because I never try to come off like I know it all, but I do like authentically pursue this career, right? And always learning and everything like that. But I do think there's some of those things that can kind of persist or lurk in the corners a little bit, as far as like, what you should and should not be doing from a scientific standpoint. You were talking about research before. Is research something that you think you want to be doing in the long term at all?
I think if I've, as I've been in the brewing industry, I'll find projects that grab me here and
Mhm.
there. So I think I would like to, focus on some research aspects within the brewing industry. And
Sure.
especially in Buffalo, like working with a brewery, hey, you're interested in this aspect of your dry hopping or your yeast strain. Okay, let's make a research project out of it. We'll collaborate on it. But even just the lab side, there's enough that comes up with that it keeps it interesting.
Sure.
So that if I come across a research project, that's cool. But the day to day where it's like, okay, now I've got these micro results. I need to dive in and see where this come from. It's enough kind of keeping me on my toes as it is.
Sure. Sure. So when we talk about quality, I've worked in a place that was like essentially a one barrel system, which it was a homebrew system. It was a Sabco.
Mm,
So it was 3 coolers or
okay.
no, 3 kegs,
Mm-hmm.
and I had to turn it 3 times in one day to make a barrel.
Oh,
So I've that place was the quality control nightmare. That
oh my
place
God.
there was no temperature control. I was fermenting in plastic.
Oh no.
Oh, everything. I mean, but the reason I took the job was it was like 1 block from my house.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it
Good
was it was it, it
experience.
was it was a good life fit.
Yes.
Yeah, and I got some good stories out of it. But yeah, so I've worked anything from that to like a 30 barrel
Mm-hmm.
automated brewery. Um, how does the word quality change, or does it change when
Mm.
you're talking about a 7 barrel pub, 1 barrel pub, up to a statewide distributed brand or a regional brand? How does that concept, or does that concept of quality change?
I think once you get to the distribution side, that's where the big change comes, where you're
Mhm.
canning and then you're kind of relinquishing control of that beer. It's out in the
Mm,
market. At that point, you don't know if it's kept warm or cold or going through those cycles. You don't know if it's still sitting on the shelf like 6, 7 months later when you had a 3-month shelf life. So
yeah.
I think that's kind of like the next level.
Hmm.
But I do think too, every brewery, I mean, of course, I work in a lab. So I want every
Sure.
brewery to do quality control. But
Sure.
depending on the size, I think every brewery can have some aspect of each of those categories of quality control. So micro, doing sensory, diacetyl, all of those things, and it can grow along with your brewery. But yes, of course, as you get larger and you're distributing more, you want to make sure nothing is going to be growing in that can that
Yeah.
3 months down the line, oh, it was sitting warm the whole time. That's not ideal, but it's
Hmm.
what happened. And now we've got something growing in it.
Hmm.
Being able to be aware of that stuff if your beer is going out, especially if it's going to other states.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure. So let's talk to our pub brewers for a little bit. Let's talk to our folks that are making beer that is never really leaving
Hmm.
their 4 walls, right?
Hmm.
They make that beer, they put it into kegs or a bright tank, and it stays cold until it's served or poured out the front in crowlers or whatever,
Yeah.
whatever. But what are some of the keys on that level? What are some of the key
Hmm.
things that people should be focusing on when that is their production scope?
I think cleanliness is that huge aspect, no matter what size your brewery is. But
Mhm.
with something like that, yeah, making sure your tanks are clean. Okay, if you think something comes up, occasionally doing micro testing if you're able to. But also just kind of keeping track of your yeast health. That's huge. And that's huge in saving money too. If you get to the point where you're able to reuse your yeast,
Mhm.
that can save a lot of money and have healthier, quicker fermentations.
How do you
So
track yeast health?
honestly, pH is a huge indicator and it's
Mm,
so simple. But yeah, looking at as soon as you start your brew, when you mix your wort and your
mhm,
yeast, like a pitch rate pH,
mhm,
as soon as you get that, you could tell how healthy the yeast is. And again, this is some data tracking over time
mhm.
with your yeast strain, your different brands. But you could get to a point where, okay, here's my starting pH. I know when this tank's going to be done. I know when it's going to be ready to be crashed.
Sure.
Just dialing in those pHs. So then let's say, okay, 24 hours, you don't see a drop in that pH. That's a problem. That might
Yeah.
be, okay, we're probably going to have to dump that batch. So within 24 hours, you can tell, all right, that's probably not going to be a good batch. We either will let it go, or we can say we don't want to reuse that yeast if we're
Yeah.
able to even get the fermentation to finish.
That's interesting. And so this is the first place. So I'm at Sonder Brewing now, and this is the first place that I've worked where 365 days a year, every beer is we do tank checks every day of the year. And so it's a daily temperature, gravity, pH, cell count to a certain point.
Yeah.
Once, like, you know, the first few days up until we get to, like, I mean, the thing's just blasting off or whatever.
Yeah.
We'll stop at that point. And then, so, and like I mentioned, pH. So it's, and it might sound like a little bit of a dummy thing to say, but I guess, like, I wasn't always tracking final pHs of my beers, right? I was a lot on the pub side, and I've been getting into that more and more through the course of my career. But tracking it every day, I never realized I can almost track my, I can predict my gravity basically based off of my pH,
Yeah.
just as well, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
but what?
so you
Go
get
ahead.
those data points, your fermentation and your pH. You can start tracking them in Excel, making your average curve based on your, different brands, if they're
Yep.
consistent and using the same yeast.
Yep.
So you'll be able to see your kind of like pH drop, and then it'll come back up a little bit as it's finishing.
Yeah.
So then if you've got a batch that, it's a huge pH drop and it doesn't come back up, okay, something's wrong there. That could be a lacto infection or something. So it gives you a better indication of, okay, something's not right here, or this is a good batch. It's acting as my other batches do.
Sure. Can you explain to me what that, because once pH, so I'll just call it terminal. I know it's more like gravity, but once it hits its lowest point, it does start creeping up again. What is at play there that is getting that pH to creep up?
Yeast death. So as the yeast is sitting, higher yeast pH, like getting closer to the 5 and above range, that could be an indication of autolysis, yeast death happening. So then that might be, all right, let's dump some yeast off the cone if that seems to be creeping higher. So with a propagation, your yeast, let's say you're starting with your wort at 5.1 or something. With a yeast propagation, it can get down to like 3.1 pH. Happy, healthy yeast is pretty acidic. So if you're seeing that creeping pretty high at the tail end of fermentation, that might be a sign you're getting some of that dead yeast. Everything's kind of spurting out, and that's what's causing that pH to drive up at the end.
Sure.
And it can be avoidable.
Okay. So I feel like everybody on Earth right now is brewing with some London variant right now for their hazes.
Yeah.
Do you have, is there anything particular that yeast strain seems to dislike? Any tips or tricks with that strain?
So London ale yeast, I like to consider it a troubled teenager. That's what I've always kind of called it. Like, it's got a lot of great aspects to it, but it's a top cropping strain. So if you're trying to harvest it, it might never come down. It might just be sitting at the top that whole time. So figuring out ways, if you do want to harvest the yeast and avoiding harvesting after a dry hop, obviously you don't want to do that. So the talk that I gave recently was about propagating your yeast instead of trying to harvest it. And again, that's not for every brewery, size, logistics. It's a little tricky to figure that out. But yeah, being able to kind of wrangle that yeast and get it where you're able to reuse it. So you're not just doing one pitch at a time. So kind of, if you're able to harvest, you're kind of selecting for the ones that settle out better. So keeping that train going if you're able to.
I've seen some things where people are talking about, like, actually trying to, like, at high Kreuzen, I think they're talking about driving CO2 through the racking arm and actually blasting Kryzen through either a vent, I'm assuming the vent of the tank,
Yeah.
into another sterile vessel or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that similar to some stuff that you've heard around that as well?
I've experienced using the CO2, but just within the tank.
Okay.
So it'll kind of raft. The London ale yeast will raft at the top, so you can
Okay.
push CO2 in. I haven't worked with pushing it into another vessel,
Okay.
but I always think the more transfer steps, the more vessels, that's potential for infection.
Yeah.
Every
Yeah.
single step you take, where it's like, okay, let's keep it to a minimum of these steps.
Yeah.
But I hadn't had great experience with the CO2 just within the tank. The
Sure.
yeast health, it wasn't great for them. So
Sure.
then that's when at the brewery I was working at, we're like, okay, let's think of a different option. We have these propagation vessels. Let's see if we can make that work with our brewing schedule.
For sure. For sure. One thing that I am using at Sonder that I have not used before is they have a sterile loop.
Mhm.
And so that's all new to me. So so I have to use the right verbiage. So any sanitizing I wanted to do in the
Mm.
past was all chemical based,
Mhm. Mhm.
PAA based, right? And then now we have access to a sterile loop. So our sterile loop runs at 85C.
Okay.
So I think 185F.
Mhm.
And so we'll use that for anything from transfer hoses, anything
Mhm.
that we need to
Yeah.
sterilize, right? And
Mhm.
that's a really that's been an eye opener for me.
Mhm.
So at larger breweries, like when you were at St. Arnold's, did they lean mostly on chemical sanitation, or did they lean on the heat sterilization?
I think it's a good combination of the two. That's what I've seen at any larger brewery. It's that
Okay.
combination of because chemical concentration can only get you so high. At a
Hmm.
certain point, you're just wasting chemicals. So
Sure.
then I think the combination of heat and then time, contact with the vessel or the hoses, I think all three of those things are important. And then with some breweries I've worked with recently, some bacteria that they didn't even know they had, it creates a biofilm on the tank. So
Mm.
then they have to do a deep cleaning. So in those cases, higher temperatures and then more contact time is what they haven't changed their chemicals too much. That seems to be okay. But
Mhm.
creating that more increased contact time helps with that biofilm and getting that off the tanks.
Is that a situation where you need to be leaning on like a pH flip too, like making sure that you're getting appropriate concentrations of caustic,
Mhm.
appropriate concentrations then of acid as well?
Yes.
Is that one of those situations that can help prevent the biofilm situation?
Yeah, I think, once you get it eradicated, then keeping up with those cleanings should keep it away.
Sure.
And a lot of times it's certain bacteria that just comes up with dry hopped beers. It's
Mm.
commonly, on the dry hop pellicles. So it's going to be in most of your beers, especially, if you're a hoppy brewery. So keeping up those not taking a day off, keeping up those cleaning practices, that it just helps.
Can sometimes I want to break, and it's just one of those things you have to get over because I think just about everybody dry hops. But it used to give me hives thinking about those hop cones on the ground. People are walking around in that room. They're
Hmm.
being scooped up by a bobcat. And you're like, wait. This
Good.
is gonna be pelletized, and then I'm just pouring it into my beer. Like I'm doing all these things from a quality standpoint to make sure this product is right.
Hmm.
And then you mentioned dry hopping as well, and some things coming from dry hopping. Um, how big of a source of contamination can dry hopping be? How much of it is just that you're leaning on the natural properties of beer to preserve?
Hmm.
Can you speak into that a little bit? Because from the outside, that's crazy
It
to
really
see
is.
that it's insane.
Yeah.
And
And
anyhow.
I think that it applies to both hops and malt. You can only get so much cleanliness in their side of the
Sure.
process, and especially malt. There's so many things that can grow on them, bacteria. So I think too, it factors in your brewing process, making
Mhm.
sure yeah, kind of relying on the brewing process and the inherent properties of alcohol.
Mhm.
Making alcohol. So making sure you're hitting your temperatures when you're doing your boil to kill off anything that might be on that malt. And then when it comes to cold side, making sure your vessels are clean.
Mhm.
So then the yeast can start, they can take over before any other bacteria or anything
Sure.
takes over. And yeah, making sure you're hitting your alcohol content so that it can kill off some of those nasty
Sure.
little guys.
Is diacetyl um is dry hop derived diacetyl something that you're seeing more and more?
Yeah, for sure. Within the last 5 years or so,
Yeah.
that, hop creep
Yeah.
kinda diacetyl,
Yeah.
and I think it's just being aware of it. There are some, enzymes and things you can use to
Mhm.
try to make it quicker, but I think it's just kinda being aware of it and tracking your beers. So
Yeah.
tracking your, gravity and pH, but also tracking for diacetyl. So it's like, "Alright, we normally do diacetyl test this day. Well, this one, let's push it a little bit. Let's keep tracking this one because it was dry hopped. We've experienced hop creep with it." And yeah, just being aware of all those different factors.
I have the budget form of diacetyl test that I've been doing for years. Um, can you talk to me a little bit about a budget diacetyl test? And for somebody that doesn't have, so what is the equipment that you would be detecting diacetyl with from a like with a machine?
Oh, so
Yeah,
from like, because you can do like a forced diacetyl with
sure.
heating it.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
that's
yeah.
like the budget friendly.
Yeah, so
And
that's
that's subjective. So that's based
yes,
on sensory. So the
yes,
other thing with that is doing like sensory training, seeing who can
yes,
actually smell diacetyl,
yeah,
who's totally blind to it in your brewery if you need a second opinion.
yeah,
So then on my side of things, I use a spectrophotometer,
yeah,
big fancy word for
yeah.
lights, prisms and things, but go through a distillation and then a couple chemical reactions to get a color reaction to show
Mm,
the diacetyl. So it'll show up as hot pink. I actually kind of like this hot pink
really?
if diacetyl is present. Once you go through the chemical reactions, and it'll be clear if there isn't diacetyl present. So then I put it in the machine and it gives me a reading of the absorbance. So then I can use that, go back to a calibrate. It's fairly complicated, but what it comes down to is giving you a ppb measurement. So you
PPB.
get a concentration
Yep, yep.
of diacetyl from that test.
And I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, isn't that 50 parts where it becomes, uh,
I want to say
yeah,
there's
yeah,
I've seen different ranges,
sure,
and it depends on your beer style as well.
yeah,
But yeah, 50 sounds about right.
yeah. Um, yeah, so tell me if my budget method is reasonable. For some I've done just like a Nalgene bottle where I can screw the top on.
Mhm.
So I'll take my sample, and I've done so it's sealed, and then I will float that in like a slow bleed of hot liquor tank water.
Mhm.
I'll just have like a little bit of hose that goes in, and I'm feeding HLT water into it. And
Mhm.
I've done that for anywhere. I know some people do 15 minutes. I've done
Mhm.
it. Typically, I did a half an hour, and
Mhm.
then I would take that out and then like try to clear my senses. Right, I would go out of the brewery.
Yeah.
Hopefully, the kitchen wasn't rolling at this point already, and then you uncap that boy
Mhm.
and you sniff. And I usually try to start like a little bit away from the container and
Mhm.
move
Yeah.
my way in. Is that a reasonable spec range for the quick and dirty, cheap and easy way?
Yeah,
Okay,
that's I think what a lot of breweries do.
sure.
And then there's a couple things you can do to tweak it if you want to make it more consistent. So I think
Okay,
with the way you're doing it, just keeping the timing consistent with
okay,
okay, I'm going to do it for 15 minutes
okay,
every time, or oh, I let it sit for an hour. there's going to be big differences in that. And then I would say,
why is that?
just it almost like burns the beer. The longer it sits with
Okay.
that hot water contact,
Hmm.
it kind of burns all so it's harder to detect diacetyl. It
Sure.
can kind of come off as a different flavor in that
Sure.
aspect. Where let's say you're doing 15 or 20 minutes, it usually comes off as that butterscotch,
Hmm.
butter, popcorn butter kind of flavor. And then again, from a scientist nerd perspective, having a control sample. So I like doing a beer straight from the tank, and then you
Yeah.
have your heated sample and you
Mm.
sniff them side by side. So you can see, okay, here's our baseline. This one was heated. This one was modified. It's
Hmm.
tasting a little bit different. All right, we'll let it sit for a little bit longer.
Hmm.
So those are my only suggestions.
I like it. I like it. Are there any other off flavors undesirable volatiles that can be pulled from that sample beyond diacetyl? Or is
Yeah.
diacetyl really the only one like for that test, like the heated sealed test?
I think for that test,
Sure.
diacetyl, and that's the main one that
Yep.
brewers worry about.
Yep.
I think there's certain things you can do for sulfur,
Okay.
but really just sulfur is kind of, for me, smelling the blow off bucket.
Oh yeah.
So just kind of using that as the indicator. But yeah, as far as I know, diacetyl is the only one that has a more in-depth test like that.
Sure. You just mentioned sulfur. What are Sulfur has always been so I am not, and maybe you can tell, I'm not like I'm not like the biggest scientific brewer. What, like, for me, when I do how water chemistry makes
Mm.
sense for me, I need certain parameters to, like, I need things to be practical and
Hmm.
functional,
Yes.
right? So you had just mentioned sulfur, and sulfur is one of these areas where I feel like there are so few um satisfactory answers
Hmm.
for sulfur production. And I know sometimes people will talk about, yeast stress,
Hmm.
nutrients,
Yeah.
variables like that. But and then also dealing with it once you have it. Can you speak to sulfur a little bit, and some of the things that could drive sulfur production in your beer?
I think it's a big yeast health thing. I think
Mhm.
that's the main factor that it comes down to. Having enough nutrients in the beginning to prevent some of that sulfur kind of burnout that
Mhm.
yeast gets. And this is especially true with hard seltzers. That
Mm.
yeast for hard seltzers, it's going through so much. It's very acidic. It's a harsh environment. So most, the seltzer, if you just have the base seltzer from a brewery, most times it's going to be pretty egg farts, pretty
Sure.
sulfury because that yeast is so stressed out. But you can do different nutrient additions with that
Mhm.
to make sure it's healthy from the get go. So I'd say that's the same with beer and brewing yeast. That's kind of the baseline, making sure your yeast is healthy and happy, and then it's not sitting on the cone for too long if you're doing cone to cone harvest or trying
Mhm.
to harvest it. But then the other aspect of sulfur can be bacterial as well.
Mm.
So that comes from the canning line. And the worst, beer infection I've ever experienced was just this awful kind of vomit, egg, fart type thing that was coming in the cans. But it was 3 months into the shelf life. So it took a long time for it to grow. We couldn't test for it as soon as it was finished in the can. And this was like little things. Once we got our DO levels down low enough, that's when these microbes really hit their sweet spot and started to grow in the beer. So then that was another canning line cleaning practice. So you've got your fermenters and all the nooks and crannies in your canning line, making sure those are clean, because bacterial sulfur is not fun either.
Bacterial sulfur. I didn't realize that. So you mentioned canning line, and canning line for me is always, I've almost exclusively worked on shabby canning lines.
Hmm.
Generally, I think it's a sliding scale of bad. with canning lines.
Yeah.
It's always in some way, shape, or form bad, but it's whether how bad it's going to be. So I'm definitely working with the nicest canning line I've ever worked with right now. One thing that always sketches me out is we have pallets of cans coming in that have the plastic slip sheets.
Yeah.
And they're fed in, whatever. And so, because, we have a decal, so it's dropping the cans. The cans do get flushed. I'm forgetting with what type of gas during like the twist rinse portion of it. But then the flip side is those the lids. They're another thing, and they're just sitting in a paper sleeve.
Yeah.
And you slap them in there, and then you're taking this beer that you're plating out. You're doing X, Y, and Z with every step along the way, and then you're just slapping it in this can. Now, you're purging it. Am I wrong? Like, does that?
No, it's terrifying.
Yeah. Well, so first of all, why does it work? Like, and maybe that's a dumb guy question, but because I know, like, I mean, I get that it's clean, that you can tell me it's clean, but is it a situation where you're trying to get the contamination as minimized as possible? That's really what it is, because you're not getting it down to zero.
Yeah, I think just the way canning lines are set up, and having those open vessels for a period of time, but then doing the twist rinse. Okay, we're doing our best to clean them out, and I think just keeping the process as speedy as possible is what makes it work. Where if you're doing crowlers, let's say you're hand filling a crowler at the bar. Oh, I have to let it sit here. A customer needed a beer and I come back to it. There's so many like air particles and things that could have gotten into that. So the canning line going quick, I think, is what makes it work. And then keeping your canning line area as clean as possible.
Yeah.
That helps cut down on microbes and whatever else is in the air, because there's lots of scary stuff in the air.
How large of a factor? So we always know that we want to have as little dissolved oxygen pickup as possible in packaging. Is there also a microbiological benefit to keeping low DO on the packaging side?
For the most part, except that sulfur bacteria that I mentioned. They thrive in low DO environments. So, as breweries get larger, that's, they get their DO levels down, and most other organisms can't survive in that if they're aerobic and they've been in the air. So they're aerobic. Let's say it gets in a can, you got low DO levels, they're not going to survive. But you've got those like little, they're called megasphaera and pectinatus, those sulfur ones. They're hiding out in the canning line and they happen to get in, and your DO levels are low, and they're like, all right, here's our time to shine. But most times it's beneficial in all aspects to have that DO low.
So this is it's not a segment, but I'm going to call this a segment. The segment is called Nightmare, Yay or Nay. All right. So you have somebody that wants to
I love it.
Yeah, okay. This might come back. I know. You have just received a beer from a partner that you're working with, a brewery partner, and that beer is in can, and it is, let's say, like 48% fruit puree.
Ooh, okay.
Okay. Talk to me about your concerns with that.
With that one, re-fermentation would be the biggest concern, depending on when they added the fruit puree, where they got the fruit puree from, all those things. So then my biggest concern would be testing for wild yeast and testing for diastatic yeast to see, all right, if something's still in there, but any yeast could, if there's a lot of sugar still left in there, could re-ferment.
Sure.
So yeah, that is what keeps me up at night, exploding cans. Honestly, that's my nightmare.
Well, yeah, and I've always, because I mean, sometimes you see it, people, um, and I was just about to say, well, no offense, but I mean, I clearly have a personal opinion about this. And listen, if you're supporting your brewery with a smoothie beer,
Mhm.
hats off to you. It's hard to make money. All right,
Yeah.
I'm not
Uh-huh.
saying that. But this is a little bit of the I'm not like a super purist,
Mhm.
but maybe this is a little bit of like the purist root showing a little bit. So you do have that situation where you have that beer that's essentially a blend
Mhm.
of beer and puree. Um, as far as stabilizing a beer like
Mm.
that, what are your options in-house for stabilizing a beer like that?
I guess if you wanted to, you could go the route of preservatives,
Uh-huh.
and other stabilizers like that, like metabisulfate. And
Hmm.
I think that applies if you're canning the
Hmm.
beer. If you just have it on tap,
Yes.
it's probably good. If you're doing the crowlers, then that's when I think customer education comes into
Yes.
play. All right, here, you got 2 weeks, you have to keep it cold. But again, once you get to the distribution, the canning, you don't know if it's kept warm. If they left
Sure.
it in the back of their hot car and then they're complaining that it exploded, well, it's like, yeah, okay, that was going to
Yeah.
happen.
Yeah.
But when it comes to preservatives, you get to a certain level where if you're having to use a lot of them, then
Hmm.
it comes through sensory wise. And
Sure.
then not every customer is okay with that level of preservatives. You
Uh-huh.
kind of have to disclose that, and they could be like,
Sure.
okay, I'm not on board with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, there was something else that was smoothie beer related. What was it? Um, all right, so smoothie beer. Yeah, I think maybe we're good there. Oh, I did want to go one step further, and you mentioned fruit source.
Mm,
So I think everybody knows Oregon fruit
mhm.
puree. There's other players out there. There's aseptic puree. There's fierce fruit. I don't know. I'm not. I don't know why I had to do that to them. But, and listen, I mean, I think I've ordered stuff from them before. There's
It's good
nothing wrong with
marketing.
that, fierce fruits. But but um and I'm not asking to name names or anything like that, but do you have trusted and
Mm,
non-trusted sources as
mhm.
far as that? And again, you don't have to call anybody out,
Yeah.
but like it, because they'll always say everything is aseptic,
Mhm.
right? That's what everybody claims.
I think it's so yeah, Oregon fruit.
Hmm.
I've always had good experiences with them, but they provide like technical sheets based on their lots and their
Yeah.
batches, so you can see that they've tested for microbes, and you can see they've given a level. So I think if you're working with a fruit supplier that is larger, you can have some local ones that don't do that, but if you're working with a larger one, you want to make sure they have a sheet of some sort that you can tell that they tested it. If
Yeah.
you were to call them and they're like, huh, what's that? It's like, oh, okay, that's a red flag right there. You should be
Sure.
testing your puree before sending it to a brewery. But again, smaller, local places can't necessarily do that, but that's the risk you're taking when you're
Sure.
using the local ones.
Sure. Um, so what are some of the primary misconceptions people have about what you do, whether it be like
Mm.
on the lab side or even what misconceptions about what people should be doing in-house, even within their own breweries?
I think one of the biggest ones that I come across is people saying, "Oh, my beer tastes good. I don't need to do any quality testing." And sure, that can work for a while, but then you get to the point, especially as breweries grow, you want that consistency. Your customers expecting your IPA to taste exactly the same every time. So you got to put a little effort in. So I think
Sure.
part of it too is breweries thinking they don't have the budget or not wanting to spend the money on quality testing,
Yeah.
but kind of showing them it really is so beneficial for your brand And then two, God forbid you have to do a recall for some, and especially if you're canning and distributing, that cost plus the cost on your reputation, it's worth it to just do quality testing and prevent that from going out into the public.
Sure. What are a few of your top bullet points for brewers for making better beer through that microbiological lens?
I would say, especially when it comes to micro, doing the testing. So either using a third-party lab service like myself, if you don't have a lab set up, or if you don't have the capabilities or you don't want to hire someone, but it doesn't have to be every single batch, but doing regular testing so that if you do have an issue or biofilms are growing in your tanks, you can catch it and you can figure that out sooner rather than later. And then two, if you don't want to use a third-party lab service, starting your own lab and doing, because micro tests aren't anything too crazy.
Sure.
Price-wise, it's definitely a little bit of a learning curve and experience with actually doing the testing. But yeah, I would say keeping up with that and being regular with that is the only way you're actually, because ignorance is bliss. You're like, all right, I don't think anything's growing. I'm not getting any off flavors, but you don't know. And it could be 3 months into your shelf life and something shows up. So I would say knowing is better than not knowing.
Sure. So I have a question for you. I've been with Sonder since late August of last year. And we're in our 6th year. The place is well established from an SOP standpoint and different things. So I'm going to flat out say that I do something here and I don't know what it's about just yet, but it's something that we do that I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts on. So once we get a beer into Bright Tank, we take 2 little samples into some skinny little tubes. Some are yellow cap and some are blue cap. And the one is called Fast Orange B tubes. Certified for PCR. It says Fast Orange. And we take little samples with them. And let me see, do I pull up the other one? Let me pause this because I was making SOPs today. And the other one is called Fast Orange Wild Yeast Tubes.
And do you do PCR?
No, we don't. But what we do is we'll go ahead and we'll flame up our sample, post alcohol, flame it up, and then we'll get a stream of beer going off that and quick open, few drops in, seal it up. And then we basically just like sit on them and wait to see if they turn nasty.
I think those are like a color indicator. Those tubes, or I believe so.
Yeah.
Are used in conjunction with PCR. I think they're an enrichment tube so that if you do have something growing, it's going to grow up a bit more.
Sure.
So yeah, that is a good way to do micro detection, kind of a quick and dirty way.
Yes.
So you could have growth, but you'd have no idea what it is unless you did the PCR step. And you wouldn't, maybe by the color, you might kind of have an idea of concentration.
Sure.
But if you have a Petri dish, you can see, I've got 4 colonies from this amount of sample.
For sure.
So yeah, I think that's a great option for a quick and dirty.
Sure. What on earth is inside of those tubes?
Couldn't tell you. No idea.
So, what?
If I were to guess, I would say something because there's one for wild yeast, right? And then one for bacteria.
Yeah.
Whatever, like yeast nutrients and things that specifically wild yeast and bacteria, whatever they need to grow up in a quicker rate. So
someone in our brewery calls it's a broth.
Yes.
That's in there. Is that right?
Yeah. I think that would be the right term for it.
It's a broth.
To kind of like, it's got all the good stuff. Like when you're sick, you have a broth. And
I was just about to ask you how you felt about that notion of it, but then you let me know immediately.
Oh yeah.
You're like, I'm all in on the broth. So that is, I have, and this is not a sanctioned technique. not by Queen City Quality Labs or Adam Makes Beer. But don't do broth shots. That's been part of the discussion. It's never happened, but there's a little vial and it has the broth in it.
Oh my
And
God.
do not do broth shots. No one's done it. I'm not saying anybody's done it, but you just this
in the event that it
in
comes up,
the event somebody says, "Hey, should we do broth shots?" No way.
Never.
It's because it's a different broth.
Yes, exactly.
It's a different broth. All right. So there's that. What else? Oh, I have some listener questions.
Ooh, cool.
This is from it's from I Am a Brewery on Instagram.
Okay.
Hey Adam, I have a question for your guest today. I recently had a tank with a second repitch of US 05 getting extreme pressure generated 4 bar. So damn. That was hopefully I'm glad that tank didn't blow up unless you got some hella strong tank that you're doing like nitro beers with, but thank goodness that didn't pop. We did not pay enough attention as we were struggling with other things, and a PRV was not placed. I hear you, man. It gets hectic in there. Thankfully, we did notice the issue before anyone could get hurt. Unfortunately, though, the beer has a strong autolysis smell and horrible taste. In order to try and save the batch, I repitched fresh yeast after dropping the whole cone. We are about to dump the whole batch. Do you have any suggestions on possible fixes, or is it a one-way solution to simply dump the batch? Now, a little caveat in here, a little add-on, and I've had this conversation with folks before. Sometimes with autolysis, I can almost pull like a sulfur root out of it or like link in some way, shape, or form. So is sulfur part of the makeup of autolysis? And then the rest of the question.
Yeah, so sulfur, it's kind of like a sulfur meaty flavor that kind of come together with that.
Yeah.
But there's a whole so the user said the beer just tastes terrible. I'm sure there's a bunch of different off flavors because like we were saying before with the pH, I'm sure that pH was pretty high by the time it finished because all those yeast cells are popping open. So you're getting a lot of crazy off flavors. In that case, even if you have dumped the cone, you still have all those flavors in there. If you're adding new yeast, they're not going to be able to clean it up. And there might not even be enough good left in that liquid for the yeast to ferment and clean it up. It's kind of a lost cause. So I think the best bet is to dump that batch. And then that saves you, it sucks. You put a lot of time and money and work hours into it, but you don't want to be releasing something like that. So in a scenario like that, it is the better decision to be dumping a batch and start fresh.
Sure. Hey, and just a tip of the hat. I'm not going to run through all the names just out of respect of time, but have some faces I haven't seen in here before. So welcome in the chat to everyone. It's good to see you all. Thank you for the support. Aaron Redding has the question. What are you're conducting business in Buffalo. So I won't say what are your top 3 favorite breweries, he asked, but he is from the Toronto area and does want to travel to Buffalo. So what are some fun spots that he could check out on the brewery side there?
Oh, breweries. Man, it's starting to get spread out, which is really cool. That it's not just within the city. Within the city, some of the main ones that have been around the longest are Big Ditch, Thin Man, and Community. They're all putting out great stuff. But just the other day, I went north, closer to like Youngstown, kind of the north towns, and Griffin Gastropub. So they've had restaurants all over the Western New York area, and now they've started brewing their own beer, and it's fantastic. They're putting out some great stuff. So I'd say, and then Rusty Nickel, that's one that's in the South Towns. I like them a lot. I've worked with them a lot, and they're putting out really great stuff and a good variety. So that would be my Western New York.
Nice.
recommendations.
What's kind of popping off locally for you right now stylistically? I know
Mm.
different spots, lagers are coming off more and more. What's kind of the up and coming thing by you?
I think we are starting to get more lagers, but IPAs are still the staple here. Um,
Hazy?
Not as many hazies. I'm starting to, because I'm not the biggest fan of hazies.
Okay.
Um, but we're starting to see some cleaner ones, kind of going
Yeah.
back to basics with the IPA. So I really like seeing that myself.
So like more of like a West Coast type build.
Yes. Hmm.
So is it like in my mind when I think of like Midwest IPA? So I'm originally from Michigan, so I think of like Two Hearted,
Hmm.
which is almost trending toward like orangish a little bit, right?
Yes.
So it's
Yeah.
it's a little bit darker, and then if I think West Coast, I think really really pale.
Yeah.
What kind of does it lean one way or the other way in your area as far as stylistically?
I'd say closer to the paler
Yeah,
IPAs, not as much. Yeah, because Too Hard it is its own beast.
yeah,
It's, pretty dark, but yeah, oh my gosh, it's fantastic.
yeah,
So yeah, I think we're more on the lighter end of
yep,
the IPAs, but super clean,
yeah,
super approachable.
yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff coming out of Buffalo.
For sure. So just a side question, and there's no wrong answers. What is if you're going to Saturday night, you're going to have a beverage.
Hmm.
Is it beer, wine, spirits, and
Mm.
what's your go-to in that range? So full disclosure, like I can barely drink. I almost can't drink beer at all
Hmm.
these days because of an issue with gluten.
Mm.
So this is there's definitely no judgment surrounding this. So what's your go-to?
Man, it kind of depends on the activity, I really like so I do a lot of meal prepping.
Uh-huh.
So on Sundays, I like to make all my meals for the week and just have a beer while I'm
Yeah,
doing
yeah.
that. But also I've been getting more, kind of on the thread of, if we've been in this industry for a while, it's getting hard to keep drinking beer at the pace that we used to. So I've been getting more into kombucha and
Yeah.
things like that. So that might be my Saturday night. Ooh, wild and crazy.
Yeah.
Uh, have a little kombucha. But if I
Yeah.
am getting wild and crazy, I do love a scotch or a whiskey. So
Really?
I'm all over the place, really.
So do you like I'm more when it comes to spirit, so I'm always one of those people that I'm always up for like the sensory experience.
Hmm.
And years ago, I was going to a friend's wedding and they're like, "Oh, so and so is going to be there. He's this big scotch guy. He really knows the scotch and he's
Yeah.
bringing this really expensive bottle of scotch." And I'm like, all right, great, whatever. So
Cool.
I get a pour of this. And so I'm ready, man. Like I sniff my arm and stuff, and then I'm diving into this boy. Right. And so I'm not even tasting anything yet. Like I'm swirling and sniffing,
Yeah.
right? And I'm excited and whatever. And I'm like, oh, like I'm pulling, this and this. And I say to the guy, I'm like, all right, so like from an aroma standpoint, like, where are you at with this? And I look up, half his glass is gone. And he goes, yeah, man, it's more about the finish. And I'm like, oh, you're just a
Oh,
wang.
okay.
You're just a wang that likes to spend a lot of money on scotch and say you're a scotch guy.
I
And
see where we're at now.
there's nothing, and good for you. You like to
Exactly.
drink expensive scotch. Bless your heart.
You like the
But
bottles on your
don't,
shelf.
yeah, but don't like say, oh, I'm like to sell it as like you're an aficionado. That's a separate thing.
And it's all
But
about the finish.
that's right. It's all about the finish. I'm like, damn, man, I don't know. I feel like you
Okay.
would.
Not
So
the journey.
when it comes to scotch for you, are you somebody that do you like the smoky peaty stuff?
I've tried to get into that and it's not my jam. I can appreciate it for what it is.
Yeah,
And every once in a while I've come across one that's like, okay, I can see, but I don't want to drink, a glass of it.
sure.
Where yeah, I'm more into just the kind of, and I'm getting more into, scotch and whiskey. It
Yeah.
was kind of my COVID thing where I was like,
Uh-huh.
all right, I'm sitting at home. Let's just start let's start drinking, which is terrible. It was a terrible idea.
It was We all coped with COVID in different ways.
We did. So yeah, I learned about bourbon.
So yeah, the smoky peaty thing doesn't quite work for me. What
Mhm.
about on the flip side with beers? Do you do
Mm.
smoke beer at all?
So actually, I judged for the New York State
Uh-huh.
competition this year. This was my first year judging with them. Again, much like the conference, the competition judging was put together so well. I think it was like 60 judges. It was 20, 30 styles that we had. It was crazy how many beers. But among the just experimental beer category, it was a smoked Helles that ended up being our
Ah,
gold medal. And I wouldn't have been like, oh, I'm gonna order a smoked Helles. It would have been like, no, I'm gonna try something else. But just kept coming back to it. It was like, this is just so clean, so
yeah,
balanced. It was good. But
yeah.
in general, I'm not the biggest smoked beer. It's sometimes it's like beef jerky and
I I agree. Well, and you know, I think it's interesting that you hit on that because the kind of the one I can do like the pale, lighter, crisper
Mhm.
smoked beer versions
Yes.
where it's you can definitely smell it, you can definitely taste it, but it's in maybe it's 30% of the beer.
Mhm.
It's not everything, right? Like it's
Yeah.
like it's an intriguing accent, right?
Mhm.
And
Yes.
something that's going to work well with food, not
Yeah.
like just this
Yes.
bacon in a glass. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I was in Austin a couple years ago, and I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but when I was at Live Oak, they had their
Oh.
Grodziskie,
Mhm.
and so like that's like
Yep.
the Polish type beer. It's like
Yeah.
low ABV, super high carb.
Mhm.
That beer was gorgeous.
Yes.
Like
They
that
make
was
great beer.
yeah, yeah.
They're awesome.
Have you actually ever had that beer? The one I was talking about, the Grodziskie from
I'm
them?
Yes, I think I have when I
Oh,
was living down in
yeah,
Texas.
yeah,
Man, it
yeah.
was good. Yeah,
It's so
everything they
good.
put out is just clean and fantastic.
Yeah. Austin Beer Garden was the other place that we
Mhm.
stopped that really loved that I really loved.
Yes.
Loved drinking all that pills and
Yeah.
it's such an interesting thing that they basically have like 5 beers,
Yeah.
6 beers on the menu and 4 of them are pills or
Yeah.
like pills adjacent.
They know what they
Uh
like doing.
yeah, hell yeah. Hell yeah. All right, so before I go too far afield, I have a question from Dem Castles. Dem Castles says, when propping up yeast from 10 mil to brew day, what's the most crucial part of
Mm.
the process for a healthy pitch? He continues, asking because I have some frozen yeast and sterile water slash vegetable glycerin mixtures in various volumes ranging from 10 mil to 500 mil. Full disclosure, I don't know what any of that means other than the measurements,
Mhm.
and that's it. So,
I think
what's your take on that?
the frozen yeast in the glycerin mixture is great. That's a great way to store your yeast, if you're able to do that. Keeps it healthy, keeps the cell walls really healthy. So then I think from that, if you're going through the different propping steps, is continuing that health. So making sure your wort has enough nutrients in it. Whether you're going from a stir plate to a vessel with agitators,
Mhm.
making sure you're getting that rotation and that oxygen in there. So yeah, kind of those baselines, your nutrients, your movement within the vessel, and then oxygen. Those are the big things I'd say.
So let's get into this nutrient notion a little bit because I've been doing some. I mean, I guess it would be more of a shallow dive, but I'm preparing for a deeper dive on the I've been listening some and reading some MBAA stuff on zinc.
Hmm.
And I feel like so many of us we've just been saying, well, okay, we're gonna get we're gonna get like the middle range of whatever the yeast nutrient package says to use
Hmm.
or the high end or whatever. It's my understanding that you can be losing a substantial amount of that to the trub and the kettle.
Hmm. Yeah.
And so what are your thoughts on that? And also we've been discussing on the channel some of the research surrounding cold side zinc
Hmm.
additions.
Hmm.
What's your take on that and just the kind of that umbrella yeast nutrient, yeast health type thing?
Well, bringing up zinc, zinc sulfate, that's one of my favorite, just kind of catch-all nutrients that you can add in. And then especially when it comes to propagating yeast, because, you really need them to be growing. Then in that case, I think you can go to the higher range instead of maybe the middle. But I think it is a case-by-case basis based on your yeast strain. Okay, maybe we'll do a little experimenting with this. We'll start with a lower range. We'll up it a little bit. If we're seeing any adverse side effects, then we'll knock it down from that higher range. So kind of a lot of like what I've been talking about with yeast presentations lately is listening to your yeast and seeing, all right, what's best for it? What's best for my propagated yeast versus yeast storage? Like with the question, before, having that glycerin storage, that's like ideal for your yeast, especially if you're going to be sitting on it for a while. If you're not sitting on it for too long, you can kind of get away with just having it in sterile water. So yeah, it can be a case by case basis with how much you're adding.
Okay. Nice. Let me pick another one. Some people have been quantifying my laugh as an evil villain laugh. How dare you? That's just the direction I'm going with that. Sean Maloney, I like this. A nice practical question. Sean Maloney asks, what model microscope would you recommend for a new brewery? Price range?
So if you're doing it for cell counting, well, actually, cell counting or gram staining, those are going to be your big uses for it. You don't need anything crazy. You can get kind of like a student's microscope, especially if you're doing cell counting. You really just need the 40x, and then just have an adjustable stand. That's all helpful, 2 eyepieces, but you really can get away with something, pretty cheap. So I would say you could get away with less than 300 for a brand new, and I would suggest a brand new microscope. I wouldn't get a used. Because you can't tell like cleaning, the lenses, how clean they are and things like that. But Scope is a good brand. And yeah, I'd look into the student or the college level microscopes because you don't need anything too crazy when it comes to cell counting, even gram staining.
Sure. Trevor, I can't speak in Trevor Daniels. This is an interesting question for me because it's Safale, right? Or is that the manufacturer? No, who's the what am I thinking here?
I've not.
Is it Safale? Well, because there's like Safale 05. Yes. Yeah, like that's what I'm talking about. Right, because they went from saying for a long time they were talking about the necessity to rehydrate that yeast. And now so that goes back to, I'm scraping my headphones against my microphone here. And the Brewers Association yeast book, which is probably dated.
Yeah.
Right. Because this is 20, whatever it was. Was this 2010? It's autographed by I have the autographed Chris White, Jamil Zainashev. Hey, you scrubs out there, just wait. I'm done with this channel. I'm cashing in. I'm selling.
You didn't know that?
I'm selling the Chris White autograph.
That's amazing.
But anyways, whenever the hell that was written. But they would talk about then that the necessity for rehydration, because at that time they were saying the way that yeast was being handled, that rehydration on wort would result in roughly 50% mortality.
Okay.
To the dried yeast.
Yeah.
Okay. And it was in part because of the cell walls impaired ability to control what was passing in and out of it.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, but now they have the whatever the hell it's called, direct pitch or whatever.
Yeah.
And I have used it, and I've used it that way and had success with it. what is your thought on that? Because that was, I mean, 10, 15 years ago, that was the thing. Like, because
Yeah.
they're saying if you're able to rehydrate with cooled or appropriately temperatured sterile water,
Hmm.
that you could get up to 98% viability
Hmm.
in right circumstances. What's your thought on that?
And yeah, I think dry yeast has come a long way in the
Mm,
past 5, 10 years. So it would depend on what the manufacturer says. But I think in general, if it's not the direct pitch scenario, I think hydration does help because
mm,
you're kind of getting that yeast ready to then go into the wort. So it's less of a shock for it.
mhm.
Okay, we're in sterile water. All right, it's kind of warm. This is nice. And then you pitch it into the wort, and then they're a little bit readier to get
Sure,
going. So that
sure.
would be my suggestion, to hydrate, unless the manufacturer is like, nope, you don't need to, um, in certain cases.
Absolutely. All right, let me look here. I don't know what that means. Uh, when doing cell counts, um, do you need to count all the squares, or are you
Mm,
good just using the outer four and the center one? I always think like on a die, how the
hmm.
five, the
Yeah,
number five there.
that's what I like to do. You got to make sure your calculations correct so
Sure.
that you have the five factor within your calculation if you're not counting all 25. I
Okay.
think too, when you're doing cell counting, you kind of want to be quick because if you're using dye to stain for viability, the longer it sits, everything's going to stain blue if you're using methylene blue. So I think there's a benefit to doing the five squares, doing those quick, and then you could do another side of the slide if you wanted to get more statistical accuracy.
Mm,
But yeah, my suggestion is doing the five and then factoring that into your calculation, unless you're
ex-
really, really quick with the 25
sure.
speedy.
Sure. Another question from Dem Castles. He's doing some, it looks like he's doing some like wild harvest stuff.
Hmm.
I recently mixed in some propped up wild yeast off a lemon tree and mixed about 5 to 10% verdant yeast from Lallemand. The mixed fermentation worked out great. The beer is saison like. Do you think, click the
Mm.
next, do you think verdant yeast will eventually overtake the wild yeast?
Hmm. That's tough without knowing what the wild yeast is.
Hmm.
That would be my suggestion to do, to get it sequenced and see what you're working with as far as the wild yeast. And then you'd have a little more because it could go either way. The
Hmm.
wild yeast could take over depending on what it is. Um, but yeah, getting it sequenced and seeing, okay, what am I actually working with here?
Hmm.
Uh, and then that way, then you could make a decision. Okay, it's going to go this way or that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
kind of tough to tell without knowing exactly what it is.
Yeah, because you get into one of those situations where sometimes one yeast will they're more aggressive,
Mhm.
right? Just
Yeah.
like in the way they do things. So let me bounce a Kavike question off of
Mm.
you. First of all, how familiar are you with that kind of? I think is it wrong to call it a branch at
I
this
think
point,
that sounds
or
right.
subcategory?
Yes.
Subcategory? Okay,
Yeah, I like that.
subcategory. Because it does seem as if because I've looked at I've looked at some maps
Mm.
of a lot of those, and they do seem to follow geography, right?
Mhm.
Like
Yeah.
they're kind of hemmed in by some my hands they're kind of hemmed in by some mountains
Yeah.
and water.
Mhm.
And they seem to be a situation where they've kind of been self-selected
Mhm.
according to process over time. Do you have any experience with that whole Kavike range of things?
Not a whole lot of experience, just because it is just kind of it does its own thing. You don't
Yeah,
have to think about it.
yeah,
Some of the actually, I worked with a seltzer place. All they did was hard seltzer,
yep.
and they would use Kvike. So they would, we'd do a cell count on it, and see, okay, viability is not great, but then they'd use it and it'd be fantastic. It would.
Yeah.
So it seems like a workhorse, but besides
Yeah.
that, not as
Yeah.
familiar with it.
It's really wild. And I think there was a period of time where people thought that it was going to kind of be like
Hmm.
essentially like the next Citra.
Yeah.
Obviously different raw material, but that thing
Yeah.
that really
The next big thing.
takes over. I do think it has some use cases
Yeah.
with things like that, but it's a curious animal.
Hmm.
It tends to drive pH a little bit
Yeah.
lower
Hmm.
in a lot of cases, and so you can kind of see um like the evolutionary like
Hmm.
bent there with it,
Yes. Yeah.
where it's kind of put in a situation where whatever will take over quickly is what's
Hmm.
going to step to the forefront
Yeah.
with those.
And
But yeah.
especially with that too, it's kind of a set it and forget it. You don't have
Uh-huh.
to worry as much about temperature. So there's a trade-off with that where, sensory, they're maybe not as nuanced, or you don't have as much control over some of those flavors. So yeah, it just depends on what you're using it for and what you want to get out of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me see here. Well, I think that might be it from the chat. Could you tell me a little bit about what you are doing with Queen City Quality Labs and some of the services that you offer?
Yeah, so kind of all the stuff we've talked about before. So micro testing, testing for wild yeast, beer spoiling bacteria, and lacto and pedio. And then I'm a TTB certified lab, so I can do ABV testing for label approval. So if you're canning and you need to verify that, I can get a TTB certified report that you can then send in.
Mhm.
And then, yeah, along with the consistency lines, IBU, SRM, BDKs, checking all those things. And the one thing that I really love doing, especially in the Buffalo area, are sensory panels.
Mhm.
So I'll bring all the supplies and I'll do an off flavor training with 10 different off flavors. So working at a brewery with their staff and usually using their beer. So a light Pilsner or
Mhm.
lager that they have on tap will spike the off flavors into their own beer. And then, it's kind of a discussion with all the employees that are participating. All right, who's picking up this off flavor? Who's super sensitive to this one, especially when it comes to diacetyl. That
Yeah.
way you can see, all right, who's sensitive to it. So that's a fun interactive thing that I can do out with breweries.
Can you work with breweries outside of New York State?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, I've been expanding past Western New York over
Mhm.
this past year. So a lot more breweries in New York State, but I'm willing to go anywhere. Free
Awesome.
trip. I'm willing
Awesome.
to have a vacation.
So yeah, is that one of those things? So is it a situation where people can they can send cans to you, or do you go do on-site work as well?
That's kind of the appeal of being in Buffalo, that there were so many breweries here. So I do a lot of pickups.
Yep.
So I'll go and they'll say, hey, we're canning today, or we need a sample pulled. I'll pull the sample for them. So that's the beauty of the Buffalo area. But I have breweries from Albany and across New York
Yep.
State that send me samples.
Yep.
So yeah, from anywhere, people can send me samples if they need anything done.
Nice. Nice. Um well, this has been a lot of fun. I've really enjoyed chatting with you. I think one of the things that's been cool about doing this YouTube podcast thing is it's putting me in contact with people that I probably wouldn't have been in contact
Hmm.
with before. And we did mention Instagram a little bit before. One of anybody that's listening, you really do need to go on Instagram and follow Queen City Quality. Is it just Queen City Quality?
Yes. Hmm.
Queen City Quality on Instagram, because and you the online space is interesting. Sometimes I feel like people that should have like some of like the more robust followers like in the space. Now,
Hmm.
obviously, like craft beer is a space. The
Yeah.
brewery world is a space. People that are doing informational fun things need to be at the people that they need to be at what is front and center with that. So you need to go on and give Jessie a follow on Instagram. Totally a worthwhile Instagram follow. Both fun, both information, all that stuff. And I was just super excited to talk with you today, and I appreciate you making time to chat. Is there anything that you wanna tell the listeners about how to get a hold of you, how to find information about Queen City Quality Labs?
Yeah, Instagram's a great place. Like you were saying, I'm always active on there and posting educational, but also fun things. So if you have anything that I've started doing Raw Material Monday, where I talk about kind of diving into raw materials. Right now we're going through malts, but if there's anything you want me to highlight or focus on, I'm always open to new ideas.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, listen, Jessie, thanks so much for coming on. This was a blast. For all of you at home, thanks for tuning in. I will have just stick with me on Instagram, or well, really Instagram for the Q&A for next month. And yeah, Jessie, thanks so much for stopping in, and we'll talk to you all later.
Thanks for having me.
All right, have a good night, everybody.